Before I tell you what happened in that tower, you have to understand the silence. It's not the quiet of a library or the hush that falls over a city when the snow is thick. It's a deep, living silence, the kind you only find miles from any road, where the wind whistling through ancient pines is the loudest thing you'll hear for days. It's a silence that can make you feel like the last person on Earth. For me, at 22, that was the whole point. I was a fire lookout trainee, assigned to the Oak Ridge Watchtower in the heart of the Bitterroot National Forest. It was a chance to escape the noise of my life back home, the arguments, the expectations, the constant grinding pressure to be someone I wasn't. 2 months of total isolation, just me, a stack of books, a radio, and a million acres of green and gray mountain ranges. It sounded less like a job and more like a salvation. My mentor, a grizzled old-timer named Frank, had given me the rundown with the enthusiasm of a man describing how to file taxes. "The job's easy," he'd grunted, his voice a low rumble like rocks grinding together. He squinted at me, his eyes pale blue chips in a face tanned to leather by decades of sun and wind. "You watch for smoke, you call it in, you check the weather twice a day, and you don't go crazy." He'd let out a dry, humorless laugh. The last guy, he went a little crazy, lasted 5 days. Frank didn't elaborate, just spat a stream of tobacco juice near my boot. I wanted to seem tough, so I didn't ask for details. I was young, full of the kind of stupid confidence that only comes from profound inexperience. I just nodded and said, "I'm tougher than him." Frank just shook his head, a flicker of something, pity maybe, in his eyes. The tower itself was a relic from another age, a wooden cabin perched on steel stilts 100 feet in the air, like some forgotten god's hunting blind. It was a single octagonal room, surrounded by a narrow catwalk that I was sure was a death trap. The only way up or down was a long, winding staircase of 137 steps, I counted, that swayed and groaned with every footfall. The inside was Spartan, a cot with a thin, lumpy mattress, a small propane stove, a dented desk, and the all-important Osborne Firefinder, a beautiful brass astrolabe-like instrument for pinpointing the location of a fire. Everything smelled of pine, dust, and rust. For the first 2 weeks, it was everything I'd hoped for. It was a monk's paradise. I'd wake up to the sun painting the mountains in strokes of impossible orange and pink, spend my days reading Kerouac and scanning the endless horizon, and fall asleep to the gentle, rhythmic roughing of the tower in the wind. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was my friend. It was peaceful. That's what I remember most clearly about the beginning, the profound, soul-deep peace. It's important you know that, so you can understand how completely and utterly it was shattered. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a sound or a sight. It was a feeling. It arrived on a Tuesday, late afternoon. The sky was a perfect cloudless blue. The air was so still the distant eagles seemed painted onto the sky. There wasn't a hint of smoke anywhere on the 360-degree horizon, but the back of my neck prickled with a sudden, intense chill. It was the primal, animal feeling of being watched, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up. I did a slow, complete circle, scanning the tree line with my binoculars, my heart starting a low, anxious drumbeat. Nothing. Just trees, rocks, and the vast, indifferent emptiness. I told myself it was just the isolation, the cabin fever Frank had warned me about. The silence twisting itself into knots in my brain. I shook it off, brewed some cowboy coffee, and forced my eyes back to the horizon. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, a low hum of anxiety just beneath the surface of the silence, a single wrong note in a perfect symphony. That night, the weather turned. This wasn't the gentle rocking I'd grown used to. This was a violent, angry gale that slammed into the tower in furious, unpredictable gusts. The whole structure shuddered and groaned like a dying beast, and I could hear the thick metal guy wire singing with a high, keening tension. I checked the reports. A storm cell was moving through, but this felt different, more personal, as if the wind was trying to rip my little sanctuary from its foundations. I tried to sleep, burrowing under 2 scratchy wool blankets, but the roar of the wind was punctuated by something else, a rhythmic, resonant
thump, 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 coming from somewhere below. My first thought was that a loose shutter was banging against a leg of the tower, or maybe a heavy branch was being flung against the structure by the wind. I tried to ignore it, to rationalize it as just a sound of the storm, but it was too regular, too deliberate. The space between each impact was almost exactly the same. It was the sound of something heavy hitting wood with intention. I slid out of my cot, the floorboards cold beneath my bare feet, and crept to the trapdoor in the middle of the floor, the only entrance to the cabin. I pressed my ear against the rough wood, listening. The wind howled a deafening roar, but underneath it, there it was again. Thump, thump, thump. It was without a doubt coming from the stairs. My heart, which had been beating in nervous rhythm, started hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was impossible. It was a 20-mile hike from the nearest road, a trail that was a treacherous scramble in broad daylight.
No one just happened to be out here, especially not in a storm like this, in the pitch black of night. Frank wasn't due for a supply drop for another 3 weeks. It had to be an animal, I told myself, my mind desperately grasping for a logical explanation. A big one. A bear trying to climb, or a moose bumping against the structure. But the rhythm was all wrong. It didn't have the clumsy, erratic quality of an animal. It sounded like a person, methodically and patiently climbing the 137 steps, one heavy, leaden footfall at a time. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a cast iron skillet from the stove, and stood over the bolted trapdoor, my knuckles turning white around the handle. The thumping continued, getting closer, louder. Step 58, 59, 60. I was counting them in my head, a terrifying ascent. Then, just as it felt like it was about halfway up, the thumping stopped. I waited, holding my breath, my ears straining so hard they ached, trying to hear anything over the roar of the wind. Nothing, just the storm. The sudden absence of the sound was somehow more terrifying. I must have stood there for 20 minutes, frozen in place, my imagination painting 1,000 horrifying scenarios. Had I imagined it? Was this it? Was this the craziness Frank had talked about? Slowly, painstakingly, I forced my muscles to unlock. It was the wind, a weird echo, a branch. It had to be. I put the skillet down, my hand trembling, and crawled back into my cot, pulling the blankets up to my chin. Sleep was an impossible dream. I was just staring into the darkness when a new sound, a quiet, intimate sound, snapped me wide awake. It was a soft, dry, scraping noise, and it was coming from right outside the window, just inches from my head. The windows in the tower wrapped around the entire octagonal cabin, a continuous band of glass designed for an unobstructed view of the forest. The catwalk outside was a narrow metal grill, barely 2 feet wide, suspended 100 feet in the air. There was absolutely no reason for anything to be out there. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. The scraping sound came again, longer this time, the distinct sound of something hard and sharp, like a fingernail or a claw, being dragged slowly across the glass pane. I was completely, totally paralyzed. I lay flat on my cot, my face buried in the musty pillow, my body rigid with a terror so profound it was almost sublime. My mind had simply shut down, refusing to process what my ears were telling it. My body was screaming at me to hide, to burrow under the blanket and make myself small and invisible, to simply cease to exist until this was over. But my training, what little I had, bubbled up from some deep, forgotten place. The radio. I had to get to the radio. It sat on the desk, on the other side of the room, its small green power light a beacon in the oppressive darkness. It felt like it was a mile away. To get to it, I'd have to cross the open floor. I'd have to go past the windows. I slid off the cot, my feet landing silently on the cold, rough wooden floor. I kept my body as low as I could, my heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm in my throat. I began to crawl, the splinters in the floorboards digging into my palms and knees. I didn't want to see what was out there. More than anything in the world, I didn't want it to see me. The scraping started again, but it had moved. It was on the next window over.
then the next. It was moving along the catwalk, slowly, deliberately, circling the tower, circling me. It knew I was inside. My hand finally closed around the cool plastic of the radio's handset. I lifted it, my thumb fumbling for the transmit button, my mind a complete blank.
I opened my mouth to speak, but only a choked, pathetic gasp came out. What could I even say? There's a sound outside my window? They think Frank was right. They'd pull me from my post. They think I was crazy. The scraping stopped directly in front of me, on the pane of glass I was crouched beneath. And then a voice cut through the howl of the wind. It wasn't a shout, it was a whisper, low and raspy and intimate, as if the speaker's lips were pressed against the glass right beside my ear. "I know you're in there," it hissed, the words seeming to bypass my ears and drill directly into my brain. The sound wasn't from the radio, it was from outside, from the catwalk, 100 feet in the air. I scrambled backwards, a guttural cry of pure terror tearing from my throat. I crab-walked away from the window, my back hitting the far wall with a loud thud. That's when I saw it. For a split second, a flash of lightning illuminated the world outside, and in that bleached, stark light, I saw a shape. A face, pale and gaunt and wrong, was pressed against the glass. Its eyes were wide, black and depthless, and its mouth was stretched open in a silent, predatory grin. It was just a brief impression, a flash of a half-glimpsed nightmare in the stormy darkness, but it was burned into the back of my eyelids. Then the lightning was gone, and the darkness rushed back in. The face vanished, the scraping stopped. The only sound was the wind, which now seemed to be filled with a low, mocking laughter. For the rest of the night, I didn't move from that spot. I sat huddled in the corner, knees pulled to my chest, the heavy iron skillet clutched in my lap. My eyes were glued to the bolted trapdoor in the floor, my ears straining to hear anything over the storm and the frantic drumming of my own heart.
The storm raged on for hours, but the other sounds, the scraping, the whispers, didn't return. The silence that followed was a different kind of torture. It was heavy, expectant. Every creak of the aging wood, every groan of the guy wires, every gust of wind that rattled the window panes sent a fresh jolt of pure, undiluted terror through me. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink. I just waited for the sun, praying for it, like a man lost at sea prays for land. When the first weak gray light of dawn finally broke through the thick clouds, it felt like a physical resurrection. I had never been so grateful to see the day. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that was washed clean and dripping. I waited another hour until the sun was fully up before I dared to move. My legs were stiff and shaky, my muscles screaming in protest. I got to my feet and did a slow, painful circuit of the room, peering out each of the 8 windows. The catwalk was empty. The forest was still and silent, draped in a thick morning mist. It was so peaceful, so normal, that for a wild second I thought I had dreamt it all. Maybe I was the crazy one after all. And that's when I saw it. On the catwalk, right below the window where the face had appeared, there was a message. It wasn't written, not exactly. It was etched into the thick grime and dust on the outside of the glass, traced by a single sharp point. 4 words, written in a jagged, spidery script. "Next time, I'll knock." I stumbled back, a wave of acrid nausea hitting me so hard I had to grab the desk for support. This was real. This was proof. Someone or something had been out there 100 feet in the air in the middle of a hurricane-force gale. They had climbed my tower, circled my tiny cabin like a shark, taunted me, and left me a promise. I lunged for the radio, my hand shaking so badly I dropped the handset twice before I could get a grip on it.
This time, the words came out in a torrent. I stammered my call sign, my voice cracking and high-pitched. "Oak Ridge to base! Oak Ridge to base! I have an emergency! I repeat, I have an emergency!" The dispatcher's voice, usually a calm and bored monotone, was sharp with concern. "Oak Ridge, what's your situation? Over." I tried to explain. the words tumbling out of me in a panicked, incoherent rush. I babbled about the thumping, the scraping, the face, the impossible writing on the window. I knew how it sounded. I knew I sounded completely, utterly insane. There was a long, static-filled pause on the other end. I could picture them in the warm, safe office, exchanging worried looks, maybe even rolling their eyes. "Okay, son," the dispatcher said finally, his voice slow and condescending, the kind you use on a hysterical child. Just try to stay calm. We're sending Frank up. He'll be there by this afternoon. Just hang tight, you hear?" Afternoon. It was only 6 a.m. The thought of spending another 10 hours in that tower, alone, was a physical weight. It was unbearable. I looked back at the window. The terrifying words were still there, a stark, undeniable promise. Then my eyes drifted downwards, past the catwalk, past the swaying stairs, to the ground far below. And my blood, which I thought couldn't get any colder, turned to absolute slush. The soft, damp earth around the base of the tower, usually a clean patchwork of pine needles and dirt, was disturbed. There were footprints, not human footprints. They were long and unnaturally narrow, with 3 sharp claw-like indentations at the tips. But that wasn't the most horrifying part. The horrifying part was that the tracks didn't lead to the tower. They started at the base of the ladder and went away from it in a straight line before disappearing into the dense, misty woods. There were no incoming tracks at all.
Frank arrived in the late afternoon, his face a grim mask of professional concern. I heard him on the stairs, his heavy boots making a comforting, familiar sound. He called my name, and I've never been so relieved to hear another human voice. When I unbolted the trapdoor and he pulled himself into the cabin, I practically fell into his arms, the story tumbling out of me again, this time punctuated by desperate sobs. He listened patiently, his tired eyes scanning the room, the windows, my pale, exhausted face. He let me finish, then walked over to the window I was pointing at, my hand trembling. "See?" I whispered, my voice raw. "See, I'm not crazy. It's right there." He squinted, leaning in close to the glass. He rubbed a calloused hand over his weary face and sighed, a long, rattling sound. "Kid," he said, and his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "There's nothing there?" I rushed to his side, my heart sinking. He was right. The message was gone. The morning sun had warmed the glass, the condensation from the storm had evaporated, and in its place was just a clear, clean pane. It had been wiped clean, as if it had never existed. My proof was gone. I looked desperately down at the ground below, pointing again. "The tracks! There were tracks!" Frank just shook his head slowly. The steady drizzle that had followed the storm had turned the soft earth to mud. The strange, clawed tracks were gone, washed away into an indistinct mess, indistinguishable from the prints Frank's own boots were now making. There was no proof. Nothing. Just the rambling, hysterical word of a terrified kid who'd spent 2 weeks alone in the woods. Frank didn't call me crazy, not to my face. He just said the silence can play tricks on you, that it has a voice of its own if you listen too long. He told me more about the last guy, the one who went a little crazy.
Apparently, he'd quit after just 5 days, claiming he kept hearing someone whispering his name on the wind, begging him to come outside. They'd found him halfway down the trail, huddled under a rock, his fingernails bloody from trying to claw his way into the earth. Frank helped me pack my few belongings into my duffel bag. I didn't argue. I couldn't spend another night in that tower. The thought of the sun going down made me feel physically ill. As we were about to leave, I took one last haunted look around the small cabin that had so recently felt like a sanctuary. My eyes fell on the Osborne firefinder. It was an old, heavy brass instrument bolted to a pedestal in the center of the room. Its surface was usually polished to a mirror shine, a point of pride for the lookouts. But now, marring the gleaming brass, was a single, long, deep scratch running from one side to the other. It was not a dent or a scuff. It was a gouge, sharp and precise, as if it had been made by a metal claw. I touched it. It was fresh. Frank followed my gaze. He saw it too. I saw his eyes widen, just for a second, before his professional mask slammed back down. He didn't say a word. He just put a heavy hand on my shoulder and guided me towards the trapdoor, locking it firmly behind us. We didn't talk on the long, silent hike back to his truck. We didn't need to. In his silence, he had confirmed everything. He knew I wasn't crazy. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me more than any storm, that I would never, ever be truly alone with the silence again. It would always have a voice, and it would always be whispering my name from just outside the window.